third grade. So today we are going to get started on a whole new story. And our story this week is called Wolf Island. And it has a different question that they want us to kind of focus in on. But all of our stories, going back to the patterns in nature and weird friends, and then this week's Wolf Island, all connect because they're all going back to this big essential question of how do plants and animals live together? And the balance of how plants and animals live together is really, really important. And it's a question that we could keep talking about in science, and we could keep talking about in literature, and we could keep talking about in different areas as we go through all these stories. So I want us to kind of keep in mind of this bigger question of how do plants and animals live together, and how we see the connection between plants and animals, how important that God put both plants and animals on this planet together, and why that's important. Okay, so if you could turn to page 307 in your reader. I don't know where to put that post-it note. Let me get rid of it over here. Let's see if that'll work. Okay, so turn to page 307 in your reader, and we're going to take a look at this together, and I'm going to read it to you if I can shrink this post-it note so that it doesn't get in our way. Okay, so page 307 talks about the food chain, and the food chain I think most of us are familiar with, but the food chain is obviously a cycle of things that go back and forth, and that one thing is dependent on the other. So let's take a look at this food chain. It looks more like a line if you look at it here, but it will start with the sun and then lead from the sun to one thing to the next, and see how one is dependent on the other. It says the food chain shows how animals and plants are connected according to the food they eat and the energy they use. Food chains demonstrate how energy moves from the sun to plants to animals. Notice in the diagram how energy from the sun works through the chain to keep the mountain lion alive. Okay, so right here the mountain lion is at the end of the food chain. Okay, it's like the highest on the food chain. It's the predator, if we would call it, right? But the energy from the sun is the first step. So without the energy from the sun, the mountain lion wouldn't survive. So let's see how that works. So first, of course, we start with the sun. Number one, the sun. The sun is the first link in this food chain. Our sun produces heat, light, and most important, energy for living things. Okay, so as we get to it in science, we're going to find out how most plants, well, how all plants, but green-leafed plants require energy from the sun in order to make their food. And wildflowers are one example of that. Plants use the sun's energy to grow. They are called producers. They produce or make their own food. So does anyone know what that process is called when plants make their own food? It's called photosynthesis. They use the energy from the sun, and they use the chemicals in their structure called chlorophyll to make their own food. They don't require us to come out and feed them breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? Plants make their own food. That is super important because they need to be able to survive in order for, here's our next step on the food chain, deer. Deer, animals such as deer, are consumers that consume or eat plants that eat plants. Animals cannot make their own food. Okay, so animals, now we know as we've learned about mammals, that many mammals can, the mother mammal can feed their babies food when they're young. But as they get older, mammals need to find their own food source, right? And so their food source, for example, this deer, are the plants. And the plants get their energy and their food from the sun, okay? Now the deer, unfortunately, is prey, right? We know that word. We've talked about that in science. The deer is prey to the mountain lion, which is the predator. Good job. The mountain lions are consumers that eat other animals such as deer. Okay, so they used two really kind of big words for us today. They used producer, when you produce something, you make something, and consumer, when you bring something in, you consume something, you take something in, okay? Now, deer are consumers. They consume the wildflowers. They don't produce anything. Now, wildflowers are considered producers because they produce their own food, but they consume the energy from the sun. So they're both consumers and producers, but because they can produce their own food, they're considered producers in this food chain. The mountain lion, which is the top of the food chain, are complete consumers, right? All they do is eat the other animals. Now, they don't just eat deer, but they eat other animals. So our question this week as we read our story will be, how can a chain of events affect plants and animals? Okay, so if one thing changes, how can it affect the entire chain? So today on our shared doc, I want you to share what you think would happen. It says, what might happen if the deer or the wildflower in this food chain disappear? Okay, so on this Google Doc that's attached, I want you to share, what do you think would happen if this wildflower is gone? There's no more wildflowers. Or if the deer is gone, what do you think would happen? What do you think the effects would be? So this is a cause and effect. So we're going to pull away the wildflowers or the deer. Now, what do you think would happen? Okay, so I want you to answer that in our Google Doc, and then you could read each other's answers. Okay. The other thing we're going to take a look at today is our unit vocabulary. Remember, this is the vocabulary that goes through every single story. And how might this work with what we're talking about today? Prefer is one of our words. Features, investigate, associate, and avoid. Remember, those are our unit vocabulary words. What could these words have to do with a food chain? Do you think that the mountain lion would prefer to eat the deer or prefer to eat the wildflowers? Do you think the deer and the mountain lion associate together? The deer is the prey, right? And the mountain lion is the predator. So they don't associate. Remember, associate is when you group together. They don't associate with each other. Let's see what other ones we could use. Avoid. Who do you think might avoid someone in this food chain? Who do you think would avoid? For sure, the deer is going to avoid the mountain lion. It's going to try, at least, right? It's the prey. It's going to try to avoid the mountain lion. Will the mountain lion try to avoid the deer? No. Can the wildflowers avoid? Now that's interesting, isn't it? Because you can't really avoid if you're not a living thing, right? Well, that's not true because flowers are living things, but they have no way of avoiding, do they? Interesting to think about, isn't it? So I want you to kind of keep those words in the back of your filing cabinet up here as we go through the story. Okay, now we have one more story that I'm going to read to you. And this is a read aloud. So you can doodle, you can draw a picture if you want to. And this story is called The Producer and the Consumer. Okay, and it's a realistic fiction. That means that it could really happen, but it didn't really happen. Producer and consumer. The shovel landed with a thud as Jacob grabbed a rake from the pile of tools. With a flurry, the boy began tugging the rake teeth through the fresh dug soil. Unopened seed packets were laid out on the grass. "Time for lunch," Grandma called from the screen porch. "Ah, Grandma, I can't stop now. I need more time, please." Grandma turned back to the kitchen, leaving Jacob to rake. She wondered why he was working so tirelessly. Jacob had never shown such interest in yard work before. Finally, after the small patch of ground was smooth, Jacob pulled a hoe sideways to dig furrows. "These little valleys will make soft beds for the seeds," Jacob thought. By then, he was hungry and thirsty. "Thanks for letting me finish, Grandma," he panted, running inside. "I must get the seeds planted today. Grandpa says we're expecting rain tonight." "And what's the big rush, Jacob?" she asked. We've been studying plants and animals at school, Grandma. I read that many animals depend on plants for food. This is part of the food chain, you know. Some are producers, some are consumers, he added with a sparkle in his eyes. Grandma nodded. Yes, of course, she answered thoughtfully. Still, what was this gardening fever all about, she wondered. Jacob ate his sandwich quietly while Grandma waited to see if she would hear more of his plan. But after remembering to say thank you, he ran back outside to plant. Jacob planted his seeds carefully, row by row. He stuck the seed packet over a stake at the end of each row. Smiling, Jacob went home, knowing his job was at least started. At last, after a week of both sunny and rainy days, little sprouts pushed their way up through the friendly tilled soil. Jacob proudly took his parents to see the surprise at Grandma's. Mother was so surprised. Jacob, this is wonderful. We will all enjoy fresh vegetables this summer. Good job, Dad said proudly. You used a lot of energy on this. Jacob smiled and said, Yes, I wanted to be a producer, not just a consumer. Now I'm both. Grandma smiled. Jacob's big project made sense now. Jacob made the family part of both sides of the food chain. Okay, both sides of the food chain. So on one side of the food chain is a consumer, someone who takes something in. And on one side of the food chain is a producer, someone who produces something. Okay, so if we go back to our original picture of our food chain on 307, the sun just produces, right? It doesn't take anything in. And the mountain lion just consumes. It doesn't give anything back, right? So they're on either end of the food chain. The sun is the producer, and the mountain lion is the consumer. Where those items in the middle, the wildflowers, produce, but they're also consumed, right? They consume the energy from the sun. Well, and then they are consumed. I used the wrong tense on that one, right? The deer consume the wildflowers, right? But they're producers in that they feed the mountain lions. So consumers and producers, in the middle, you're both. But on either end, you're either one or the other, right? Okay, so now let's take a look at this. Let's give some examples. Jacob ate his sandwich. Is that being a consumer or a producer? Jacob ate his sandwich. So Jacob ate a sandwich. It would be how he consumed. Jacob planted seeds would be how he's producing something. He's making something. When you produce something, you make something. You produce. When you consume, you take it in. Okay, so that was from the story. What about in our life? Are we consumers or producers? Or are we both? Okay, so we all just finished a delicious Thanksgiving dinner with meat, potatoes, and vegetables, and gravy, and rolls. Were we producers for that dinner, or were you consumers? Totally consumers, right? We consumed that dinner. But many of us plant gardens. We might plant vegetable gardens, or we have gardens in our yard that feed other animals, or we might, right? That way we are producers. Very nice. Okay, so those are two words that I want us to keep in our minds, producers and consumers, which are opposites, but you can also be both, like humans are both producers and consumers. And I want us to be thinking of the food chain as we go through this story this week, which is a realistic fiction story called Wolf Island. But it is fiction, it's a made-up story, but it's realistic. It could really happen. So we'll find out what that story's all about later this week. Alrighty, my friends. Have a great day. Bye.